So a lot of you have probably noticed the large exclosure that's in the north center pivot just west of the orchard house. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of the studies that is in that exclosure. It's one of the larger studies, and it's been ongoing for the past 2 or 3 years, and we affectionately call it the nurse plant study. And as Philip said, it's taken a lot of manpower to keep this study going. So I'm going to talk to you about that today. We're looking at how nurse plants can possibly facilitate the growth of antelope bitterbrush. And we're looking at the uses of different soil inoculums, nurse plant species, and the proximity of bitterbrush to those nurse plant species, and how that can affect the growth of bitterbrush. So priority effects occur when an earlier established species has an influence on a species of plant that is later establishing. So these relationships can be either facilitative or inhibitive. And these interactions between priority effects do play an important role in structuring plant communities. And in our area, in the Intermontane West, they're poorly understood. So a nurse plant is an earlier established plant that has a beneficial or facilitative influence on the growth of a later establishing plant. And we would call these later establishing plants the beneficiary species. The facilitative role that nurse plants play onto the beneficiary species is also found to be important in structuring plant communities. And here I just have a diagram of the facilitative effect of a nurse plant onto a beneficiary species. So you can see that this plant growing under the canopy of the nurse plant is doing better than the plant growing on the outside in the gaps outside the canopy cover. Whereas this shows an interference relationship where the plant growing underneath the canopy is actually, its growth is impeded as opposed to growing in the gaps outside of the canopy cover. In 1995, Dr. Calloway from did a review of positive interactions amongst plants. And this is a table from that paper. And at that time, there was already around 169 papers that had documented the facilitative relationships of nurse plants onto their beneficiary species. And at this time, among those 169 studies, around a quarter of them showed that gave an example of shrubs as the nurse plant, and around 6% of them, a lower proportion, used shrubs as the beneficiary species. So what are the mechanisms by which nurse plants facilitate growth of their beneficiaries? So how do nurse plants help? They can offer protection from harsh environmental conditions. So through shading and canopy cover, they can offer protection from shading. They can offer protection from wind and sun through shading, and offer protection from evaporation, so help with water loss in harsher environments. They can also help eliminate competitors of the beneficiary by taking up niche space that could otherwise be taken up by competitors of the beneficiary species. Been shown to offer protection from herbivores. There's some studies showing that more palatable species of plant grown in mixtures of less palatable species are actually ignored more often than palatable species grown on their own. They can alter the microbial environment. They can attract pollinators to their beneficiaries. They've been shown to increase soil nutrient availability, as an example if a nurse plant is a nitrogen fixer, or they can also increase nutrients by litter fall from the canopy. And they've been shown to change soil characteristics. So we wanted to look at using nurse plants for restoration. The examples of facilitation via nurse plants are usually higher in areas that the environmental conditions are harsher. And we wanted to look at how those facilitative effects could be used on the ranch in areas that are harsh environments where we have a difficult time establishing natives. But the interactions are complex and will definitely differ on the species of nurse plant that we use and the beneficiary species we use and the environment with which they're planted. We also wanted to look at arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in restoration, and luckily Ilva went over all this so I don't have to explain what AMF are. But it's been shown that AMF are actually typically have a lower diversity of AMF in agricultural areas compared to native prairie soils. So how can we improve AMF in these degraded areas? Recently there was a study by Middleton and Bever that showed that when they inoculated native seedlings with prairie soil and then planted them into a degraded area, that it was improved the nurse plant establishment, and that effect was also able to spread to the neighbors. We also want to look at bitterbrush as beneficiaries. So as I said, there's a lot of studies documenting the benefits that shrubs pose as facilitative nurse plants, but we want to look at the opposite. If shrub plants, how well they are used as the beneficiary species with an herbaceous species as the nurse plant. So we're looking at bitterbrush, antelope bitterbrush, Persea tridentata. Bitterbrush, we like it on the ranch. It's an important browse species. It provides habitat. Our goal is to successfully plant bitterbrush into patches and the lower elevation areas of the ranch, but in order to do that, we need to know the optimal conditions for bitterbrush growth. So we want to look at how bitterbrush growth, if it can be improved by the presence of a nurse plant, if soil inoculum from high diversity native areas can be improved plant growth in degraded, abandoned agricultural areas. Also, if that inoculum from nurse plants is able to spread to nearby neighbors, and how does the position of bitterbrush relative to those nurse plants affect the growth of bitterbrush? So what we did was collected whole soil from 3 different areas on the ranch. One of the areas was in sheep camp, which is an area that has a high diversity of native species. And the second native area was just above the top house. And the third area is our control, where our experiment is in the north center pivot it's basically dominated by weeds. So we used 3 different functional groups. One was a grass, which is bottlebrush squirreltail, a forb, blanket flower, and a nitrogen-fixing legume, a prairie clover. And we planted those 3 different species into the 3 different whole soil inoculums. And then we added another layer of treatment where we added AMF-specific strains of inoculum. So within those 4 treatments, we had no inoculum. We had a species of AMF that was cultured from the ranch, a strain of that, Glomus atunicatum, and another strain of that same species. And then the 4th added inoculum was a mixture of the 2 strains that was sterilized to kill AMF spores. So those plants were allowed to grow in the greenhouse until the seedling stage. And then in spring 2011, we planted the nurse plants into the agricultural area in the north pivot. And this is just to give you an idea of how large it is. It's probably only a quarter of what Ilva's going to be putting in, but it was pretty big at the time. We dug around 600 holes in this exclosure and planted the nurse plants. And we just left them alone that first year, so they were able to grow to maturity. And this is a picture of a mature blanket flower. It's hard to see, but prairie clover and squirreltail. So the following year, before you can see the nurse plant growth from the last year, they haven't started to grow yet. We planted bitterbrush seeds around each of the nurse plants. So this is Prairie and Mike planting bitterbrush seeds. And we fashioned this tool here, which has just 6 evenly spaced screws in it, so we can make an imprint into the soil and plant each bitterbrush seed at an even spacing from each other. So we planted from 5 inches and 8 inches away from each nurse plant on all 4 corners. And we only planted 5 seeds in those rows. The extra 6 space was left for temperature buttons to be put in around a subset of nurse plants. So the temperature buttons, which are these metallic things, were set to record the temperature at every hour in those spaces, so we could get at different microsite differences around the nurse plants. And then last summer, we measured the width and height of all the nurse plants, and we measured the height of the bitterbrush in the summer and the fall. And this is just from like a week ago. The bitterbrush are pretty big. This is just my highlighter to give some scale. And that's a bottle brush that hasn't started to grow yet. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the preliminary results we have. It's mostly just dealing with the average bitterbrush heights that we've measured. So here we have the average bitterbrush height in centimeters, and this is the differences within each nurse plant treatment. So this first one is where bitterbrush was growing with no nurse plant, our grass, prairie clover, and blanket flower. And the growth is highest on average without any nurse plant around it, and lowest around, growing around blanket flower. And then just to give you an idea of size of each nurse plant, this graph is what we had of the measurements of nurse plants of height and width. And you can see that obviously the control, there's no plant there, so it's at 0. And blanket flower was our largest nurse plant. So there appears to be a negative correlation between bitterbrush height and nurse plant height. This is the results of the different soil inoculums. So again, that's average bitterbrush height and the different soil origins. This is from above the top house, sheep camp, and the control area. And bitterbrush tended to have a higher growth rate in the native soils collected from the sheep camp area compared to the native soils collected from the top house, above the top house area. Position also had an effect on bitterbrush growth. The average bitterbrush heights tended to be higher when on the south side of a nurse plant compared to when grown on the west side of a nurse plant. And we went into the exposure in the early fall and noticed that the bitterbrush had grown, it seemed to have grown quite a bit since we'd looked at it last in the summer. So we thought we should definitely measure that. So we did a second fall measure, and this is what we found. So here is the percent of growth that occurred just in the fall, the percent of total growth that occurred in the fall. And these are the different nurse plants treatments: no nurse plant, squirrel tail, prairie clover, and blanket flower. And the highest percentage of growth in the fall was when bitterbrush were grown around the control and around squirrel tail. Over here is just a graph of the rainfall that we received on the ranch from March to December. We planted in March, and we did our first measurement in the summer, and this is when we did our fall measurement in December. But I'm assuming that bitterbrush probably went dormant sometime between October and December, but I'm not sure when that would happen. But this is just to show that there was definite period of drought and then a boom in rainfall that probably facilitated the growth of those bitterbrush, as well as the absence of nurse plants which had senesced at that point. And this is a graph of the fall and summer growth side by side, just to give you an idea of the changes between the two seasons. So we have average bitterbrush height here, and then our nurse plant species again on the bottom on the x-axis. Beige is our summer growth, and teal is the summer and fall growth combined. And if you look at the summer growth, the squirrel tail, bitterbrush growing around squirrel tail, was on average smaller in height, but when we measured again, there seemed to be somewhat of a temporal shift between the two seasons, and those differences were not significant when we looked at those measurements again between control and squirrel tail. So bitterbrush growth was higher in the controls and when growing around bottlebrush squirrel tail. The growth changed based on the direction of planting, but we didn't find any differences between the proximity, so whether the bitterbrush was growing close or far from a nurse plant. And bitterbrush growth was also unchanged when in the presence of another bitterbrush. So if one was growing side by side, it didn't seem to affect the height. And the height of bitterbrush changed based on soil origin, the 3 whole soils, but not with the added 4 inoculum treatments. And a large percentage of growth occurred in the fall when nurse plants had senesced, and the fall growth was greatest when next to squirrel tail. So based on this just preliminary data, bitterbrush does not seem to benefit from a nurse plant, but growth seems to be unaffected by bottlebrush squirrel tail. So this is important because we need to find a species that we can plant alongside bitterbrush in restoration mixes that's not going to inhibit their growth, and squirrel tail might be able to fit this purpose. So in the future, we're going to be incorporating that temperature data. We have temperature buttons in the ground right now recording. We're also going to be taking moisture readings this summer, and we're going to be measuring bitterbrush growth in the spring and fall again this year. And we're going to be doing a bit of a more detailed measurement, not just height. We're going to try and get at spread of the bitterbrush. And there's also differences in phenology between the 3 nurse plants that we want to capture. So the grass is actually starting to green up right now. The blanket flower probably won't start to emerge for another month or 2. So we want to be able to capture some kind of temporal shift in growth of the bitterbrush around each nurse plant. And if this pans out, we may potentially study below ground interactions as well. And I just want to thank everyone that spent a ton of time weeding in that nurse plant because it's taken a lot of manpower. But take questions.